Well, thank you, Marie, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for coming. It's a terrific crowd. I knew it was 10 years ago, I think we did a rededication of the Ladd and Whitney Monument, and there must have been 300 people that showed up for it. And it was, that convinced me that the Civil War is still a very vital topic. And it's one of the things I think that motivated me to become more immersed in it. So what I'm going to talk about today is really the opening month of the Civil War, and how a number of people from Lowell really found themselves right in the middle of very critical events in our nation's history. The story, my involvement in this story kind of starts in this building in the background, Lowell City Hall, a place that, thanks to my dad, Richard Howe Sr., who's kind enough to join us here today, who was elected to the Lowell City Council when I was 7 years old, I spent many days going in and out of that building. And what always attracted my attention was this obelisk monument to its front. It looked like a miniature Washington monument. And eventually I got over and read the plaques on the side. And it's dedicated to Luther Ladd and Addison Whitney, who were these two fellows here, two young mill workers from Lowell. And the thing that always fascinated me, that in the 5 years of the American Civil War, there were 620,000 men who died from combat and from disease. And two of the first four to die, to be killed in action, were from Lowell, Massachusetts. So I was always fascinated by why that was so. How did these guys from Lowell get to be at this critical point in the start of the Civil War? So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is how they got there, and then not only what happened to Ladd and Whitney, but what happened to the other 200 men from Lowell who were with them in the next couple of weeks, which were very critical. Luther Ladd was he was 17 years old when the Civil War began, and Addison Whitney was 22. They were both from, they weren't born in Lowell. One came from New Hampshire, one came from Maine. They came here to work in the mills like so many other young men did. Our story could begin, I guess, in the early 1600s when the first slave arrived in America, but for our purposes today, we'll start with the presidential election of 1860. The Democratic Party had split in two, into a northern wing and a southern wing. So you had Stephen Douglas was the nominee of the Northern Democrats, and John Breckinridge was the nominee of the Southern Democrats. And another party, the Constitution Union Party, formed, and its nominee was John Bell. Their platform was really to preserve the Union. And then there was the Republican Party, which was still very new. It had first fielded a candidate for president in the prior election in 1856, unsuccessfully. But Abraham Lincoln was that party's nominee. And of course, Lincoln was elected. And this is the outcome of the election. Lincoln only received 40% of the popular vote, but he received an overwhelming number of the electoral votes. Stephen Douglas finished second in popular vote total, but he only received 12 electoral votes because the North did go overwhelmingly for the Republicans. Breckinridge got 18% of the vote with 72 electoral votes, and Bell got 13% of the vote with 39 electoral votes. It didn't take long for the state of South Carolina to secede from the Union. On December 20th, that state said, we're not part of the United States anymore, and soon thereafter, 6 states of the Deep South, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, all left the Union as well. Now, in the election of November of 1860, Abraham Lincoln wasn't the only new executive elected. Massachusetts elected a new governor, John Andrew, who was a Republican who had very strong abolitionist feelings. One of Andrew's foremost political opponents was a fellow from Lowell named Benjamin Butler. Now, Butler and Andrew were political opponents, but in December of 1860, before Andrew took office, before Christmas, they both traveled to Washington, D.C., independent of each other for very different reasons. Andrew went to meet with some of the prominent Republicans from Massachusetts who were serving in Washington and others. Butler went to a meeting of the Breckinridge Democrats, which was primarily men from the South. Both of them came away from these meetings convinced that there was going to be a war, that secession was not something that was just going to blow over and that the country would come back together. They were sincerely convinced that there was going to be a fight for the future of the United States. And they returned to Massachusetts determined to transform our state's militia from what was essentially a social club into a field army capable of participating in that war. Now, the pre-war militia in Lowell and through most of the Commonwealth was characterized by independent companies. And a company can be anywhere from 50 to 100 men. And they were organized over time. The Watson Light Guard was organized in 1851. The Mechanic Phalanx was organized in 1825, before Lowell even became a town. The one thing they had in common was they all had dissimilar uniforms. Ironically, most of them were gray, but their uniforms were it wasn't like everyone had the standard issue uniform. They all sort of competed to have the fanciest, most comment-worthy uniforms. Now, if you just scan through the local newspapers from even January of 1861, it kind of gives you a taste of what life in the militia was like. This one company had a very successful banquet where they feasted on oysters and were entertained by the company glee club. Now, the company only had 50 soldiers in it, so they have enough, out of 50, they feel they have enough strength to form a glee club. That, again, shows you where their priorities were. This company participated in 14 parades in the last 6 months, and the newspaper reporter felt obligated to report that if America had more companies like this one, there'd be no need to fight. The Davis Guards, which was from Acton, that was one of the companies in the 6th Regiment, gave a levee which was attended by General Butler, Colonel Jones, and others. In January 25th, 1861, the phalanx parties, the Mechanic Phalanx right here in Lowell, they had a series of parties that closed Thursday night, but as the season of dancing is not yet over, the phalanx are meditated for 4 additional parties. So you can see that was the state of mind of the militia. As I said, it was more of a social club. But as I said, Ben Butler and John Andrew were determined to change that, and that started in January, right after Andrew took office, when he issued what was known as General Order Number 4. And that basically said that if, because of work commitments, family commitments, moral commitments, philosophical commitments, you will not be able to mobilize and move out of Massachusetts and go probably to Washington at very short notice in the event a war breaks out. If you can't be ready to do that, you should resign and let somebody else take your place. And as a result of General Order Number 4, which was actually embraced by the officers like Ben Butler, Colonel Jones, the 6th Regiment lost 25% of its strength in January and February, and the unit was refreshed with a lot of younger men like Ladd and Whitney who were, I think the average age of the privates in the 6th Regiment when they went to Baltimore was in their early 20s. It was filled with a lot of young, both mill workers and people in the building trades, but really there were people from every occupation. And what Butler and there's a letter, I didn't make a slide about it, but Governor Andrew sent an inquiry out to the regimental commanders. One went to Colonel Jones and said, "What do you need to get ready?" And the letter from Jones is very, it's informative about the state of the militia, which we got into a few minutes ago. He said that we need all new uniforms. The uniforms that we have now are made out of the finest material, and quoting him, they're cut in very tight in the way that's fashionable today. So their uniforms were more for display and parades and dress. They wouldn't last 48 hours in a field operation. And so they started changing the equipment and the uniforms that the militia troops had. Well, even though Governor Andrew took office in January, the President of the United States in 1861 did not take office till March. So March 4th, Abraham Lincoln became president. His second day on the job, he shows up at his desk and somebody tells him about Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a United States Army fortress. It's in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. And it was basically it was being starved out by the South Carolina militia. Just to give you some geographical perspective, this is the east coast of the United States. And up here we have Lowell, Washington, and way down here is Charleston. Now this is the harbor at Charleston, and you'll have to bear with me. The Atlantic Ocean is out here, but this smooth green area is water. It's the rough area here, here, and over here that's the land. One of the things I'm going to talk about quite a bit today is the geography, because both from my study of history, my experience in the Army, and other places, I think I found that to understand events, it's really important to understand the geography, because that plays such an important role in it. Well, Charleston is actually a peninsula. It's a peninsula formed by the Ashley River here and the Cooper River here. And this is the entrance from the Atlantic Ocean. On this northern edge, on this shoulder here, is a fort called Fort Moultrie, which actually dated back to the Revolutionary War. That's where it got its name. And it was maintained as an active fort. But this opening of the harbor was such that ships could kind of sneak back past at a longer range of these guns. One of the essential points of gunnery is to get your target in a crossfire, to have guns shooting from both sides intersecting at the target. So it was natural to seek a fortification on the south side of this opening. And there's this little island here, a little rocky island that was uninhabited, that the United States Army chose to build Fort Sumter. And it began in the 1840s, I believe, and it was still under construction in 1860. They had sort of like the big dig management approach would have fit in very well in fortress construction in the 19th century. Now, because Fort Moultrie was on the land and the garrison depended on the locals to provide it with food, that's where all the soldiers were. And there weren't that many soldiers. The commander was a very experienced older major named Robert Anderson, who he had actually taught for quite a long time at West Point, and many of his students were people who became generals in the Civil War. He was from Kentucky, and there was some concern about his loyalty, because so many of the officers, both in the United States Navy and the United States Army leading up to the Civil War, were from the South, and they had a tendency to undermine the government's position. Anderson was loyal, though, and he was a very good soldier. He only had 85 men under his command. To effectively garrison Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter at the same time would probably have taken 800 to 1,000. So he had 85 regular troops pre-war. Now, as an interesting historical footnote, his second in command was Captain Abner Doubleday. So at some later time, we'll have a debate about his role in inventing baseball. But he went on to fight at Gettysburg. He was a general in the Union Army, and he had a very prominent military career. But he was also at Fort Sumter. Now, this is a picture of Fort Moultrie taken from the seaside. Moultrie was designed as an artillery platform to fire against ships. It really wasn't designed to protect itself against a land invasion. And it was in a state of disrepair. The wind and the waves had washed sand up so that sand dunes actually came right up to the top of this wall. And the inhabitants that lived around Moultrie would routinely walk up to the walls. So even though Anderson had his entire garrison in Moultrie, he thought it was very much exposed and at great risk. So what he did was on the evening of Christmas night, or it might have been the night after Christmas, he snuck his 85 men from Moultrie out into the harbor to Fort Sumter. He loaded them up in boats in December in the middle of the night, and they quietly rowed across, and they occupied Fort Sumter. The South Carolina routinely had boats patrolling the gap between. Just like George Washington's attack on Trenton, and at Christmas time, Anderson took advantage of the holiday to have the South Carolinians let their guard down, and he was able to sneak across. But one of the problems he had was he only had enough boats to take his men, and he wasn't able to get very much in the way of supplies over to Fort Sumter. So they actually only had about they had several months' worth of, crackers and salted meat, and not stuff that was very appetizing, but it would have kept them alive, but they didn't have all that much of that. This is actually a picture of Fort Sumter. It's only 1 story tall now. When it was constructed in 1861, it was actually 3 stories tall. It was all made of brick. It doesn't look all that differently than the wall to your left does. It was bombarded by the Union later in the Civil War, which is what knocked off the first 2 levels. And in World War II, in the inside there's this black concrete gun emplacement that was used for coastal defense in World War II. So other than sitting there on that island, Sumter doesn't look a whole lot like it would have looked in 1861. And this is a picture of one of the gun emplacements. That duplicates what it looks like in 1861, except for the rail it's sitting on. But you can see the brickwork is not all that different than this mill building. All right, here's where Lowell again intervenes in events. So Lincoln takes office on March 4th. He's got a lot of things on his hands. He doesn't have thousands of people in the executive office. But this issue of Fort Sumter is eating away at him because he keeps getting messages from Major Anderson that he's running out of food, that he only has enough food to sustain him until April 15th. April 15th was the critical date. If they didn't get resupplied by that day, he'd have to surrender the fort. And Lincoln didn't want to surrender the fort because that would be an acknowledgement that there was another country involved in this, when Lincoln legalistically, and I think the way he actually thought is, these people are rebels, they're criminals, they've committed treasonous activities, and the last thing I want to do is to be turning over, or without a fight, turning over United States installation and property. But he didn't know what to do. It wasn't like today where you call down to Fort Bragg and get the Delta Force ready and send them out. The military didn't have that kind of capability. Lincoln's entire cabinet advocated just giving up Fort Sumter. We don't want a war. Let's just hand it over, and we'll make our stand somewhere else. But the Postmaster General, a member of the cabinet, a man named Montgomery Blair, was very vociferous in his in saying we've got to draw the line here. We can't back away from Fort Sumter. And I can imagine Lincoln saying, "Yeah, but what are we going to do?" And Blair said, "My brother-in-law has some ideas on this, and I'd like you to talk to him." And his brother-in-law was Gustavus Fox, who was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy and had served as a lieutenant in the United States Navy, but he got out and he was in business. And so Lincoln said, "Sure, bring him in and we'll talk to him," which to me, that little vignette just tells you how the government worked back then. Can you imagine Barack Obama or George W. Bush having somebody's brother-in-law come in to brief him on a proposed plan to resupply to a remote garrison somewhere? And Fox actually had a plan that attracted Lincoln. What Fox proposed to do was to take a large steamship from New York City, have the supplies loaded in smaller parcels, have a couple of warships accompanying them for security, and bring along 3 tugboats from New York City, which took very little draft. Once they get down to South Carolina at night, he would send the tugboats in, each with a separate amount of food, and he thought one or more of them could sneak in and get over the sandbars that made it difficult for bigger ships to get in. So Lincoln said, all right, go ahead. So Fox headed to New York City and started outfitting his expedition. But what Lincoln did, Lincoln was playing this chess match. He did not want to be the one to fire first. So it's kind of like this game of chicken. Who's gonna be the one to fire first? So on April 6th, Lincoln sends a message to the governor of South Carolina and says, we're coming down to resupply Fort Sumter. All we're going to do is give them food out of humanitarian concerns. We want to let them sustain their lives. We're not going to reinforce them. We're not going to give them any war materials, just some food. And 3 days later, Fox sails from New York City. Well, predictably, South Carolina and the rest of the Confederacy is in a tizzy. They have emergency meetings. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? We can't let them resupply this fort. We've got to make our stand. And they decide they're going to demand the surrender of Fort Sumter, and if Major Anderson doesn't comply, they're going to take the fort by force. And so on April 11th, they demand the surrender. April 12th at 4:30 in the morning, they begin firing. Just within hours of that, Fox's fleet arrives out in the ocean. Unfortunately, it was very stormy. All 3 of the tugboats had either become disabled or had turned back. One of the warships had been diverted to another place. And so he was out. So Fox essentially became a distant spectator of the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Everyone could see his ships out in the ocean, but they didn't have the capability to come in and try to force their way in. The bombardment continued for 36 hours. The walls of Fort Sumter stood up pretty well. In fact, none of the soldiers within Fort Sumter were killed in this bombardment. And that was partly because Anderson kept them inside the lower levels. The biggest guns on Sumter were on its 3rd level, which were exposed to the outside. But he thought that was just too dangerous and what was essentially a futile cause. So he kept everyone inside. Unfortunately, there were wooden structures inside the fort, a large barracks building, and that's what caught fire, and that's what made this appear to be an inferno, and I'm sure it was quite unnerving to the men inside. And again, it's reaching that April 15th, we're going to run out of food and have to surrender anyway. So on the evening of Saturday, April 13th, Major Anderson surrenders Fort Sumter. But it was an unconditional surrender. He extracted certain terms. One of them was he could fire a salute to the flag of the United States, that he could take all of his equipment out with him. And the Confederates agreed that the next day he could do that. So on April 14th, they fired their salute. They loaded up a ship, but the ship didn't get away in time because of the tide, and it had to stay at Fort Sumter through the night, and they had to listen to the exuberant Confederates giving speeches and celebrating inside. That same day, Lincoln met with his cabinet, and they agreed to issue a summons for 75,000 volunteer soldiers from the different states to suppress the rebellion. Now, at that point, this is the makeup of the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Just disregard these blocks for now. It consisted of 8 companies. 4 were from Lowell, 1 was from Groton, 1 was from Acton, and 2 were from Lawrence. The summons asked for regiments of 10 companies or a certain number of men. And so in this sort of ad hoc organization going in Boston of the state's militia, the governor of Massachusetts and his military advisors decided to add 3 independent companies, one from Worcester, one from Boston, and one from Stoneham, to the 6th. So it was going to have a total of 11 companies of soldiers. Monday, the garrison of Fort Sumter sails out to, Fox is going to take them back. They're not held prisoner, they're released. Governor Andrews sends a telegram to Colonel Jones. It says, muster your regiment on Boston Common as soon as possible. And in Lowell, all of these militia companies start grabbing their equipment and getting ready to move out. It said that they spent the night at the Armory, which is actually just down the street from here. It was called the Old Market Building, which I knew was the police station, and then it was the gas company, and I think it's a credit union. It's on Market Street right down near the intersection with Merrimack. So that's where all of these soldiers spent the night of April 15th, 1861, getting ready to move out. On Tuesday, the 4 other companies of the 6th, the ones from Acton, Groton, and the 2 from Lawrence, they both arrive in Lowell. They have a big send-off ceremony at Huntington Hall. This is a picture of Huntington Hall. That was at the corner of Dutton and Merrimack Street. If you notice these arches in the building, the next time you're over near Subway and the phone store on Merrimack Street, as you head towards City Hall, there's some brickwork that seeks to duplicate these arches. Now, Huntington Hall's primary purpose was the train station. The first level was a station, and the trains would head out and go up Dutton Street. That's why that locomotive is sitting where it is. That was the site of the main train station. And the upper 2 floors were a public assembly hall. So they have a big ceremony there. The mayor gives a speech, a clergyman gives an invocation, and at 11:45 the train to Boston departs. The regiment gets off, they go through Faneuil Hall, and they spend the night at a place called Boylston Hall, which is at the corner of Boylston and Washington Streets in the Theater District. It's right across from where the Registry of Motor Vehicles building is now on Washington Street. The next day, April 17th, these 3 other companies are attached to the 6th Regiment. The 6th Regiment and 3 other Massachusetts regiments form on Boston Common in front of the State House. They're giving their regimental flags by the governor. They're given some additional equipment. And at 7 p.m., the 6th Regiment gets on a train and heads west and then south through Hartford, Connecticut, heading for New York City. And points south. That same day, Virginia votes to secede from the Union. Virginia was critical. Lincoln had hoped to keep that in the Union, but on the 17th, it voted to secede, largely as a response to the call for the $75,000 troops, 75,000 troops, which is very controversial. This is a photograph of the 6th Regiment marching through the streets of Boston. There were 4 Massachusetts regiments that were ready to go. The 3rd, which was from New Bedford, its destination was Fort Monroe. We'll see that on a subsequent map. The 4th, which was based in Quincy, had the same destination. And the 6th was going to Washington, and the 8th, which was from Lynn and the North Shore, was going to follow the 6th to Washington. Thursday, April 18th. So remember, at 7 p.m., the 6th Regiment gets on the train in Boston. They on the train all night long. They arrive in New York City the next morning. 3 big hotels throw open their dining rooms. That's where the soldiers had their breakfast. They then march down Broadway, huge parade, people hanging out the windows, cheering them. They get to the tip of Lower Manhattan. They board a ferry that takes them over to New Jersey. And the train they're on starts heading for Philadelphia, excuse me. And they arrive in Philadelphia at 8 o'clock that night. Now, this middle event I'm talking about is kind of critical. The bullet point says, unarmed Pennsylvania regiment is accosted in Baltimore. Well, it wasn't only soldiers from Massachusetts that were getting ready to move out. All over the North, there were units that were getting together. But very few of them were anywhere near the state of readiness of those from Massachusetts. And that's where Governor Andrew and Ben Butler's foresight was so important. Pennsylvania, they just sort of grabbed 800 men and threw them together. They didn't have uniforms and they didn't have guns. The General Winfield Scott said, just send them here, we'll get them guns once they get here. So there were these 800 soldiers on board this train coming from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, heading for Washington. And when it got to Baltimore, the people at Baltimore had very pro-Southern sympathies. And so they tried to stop those soldiers from passing through. And a near riot occurred on April 18th. The only thing that got those soldiers through was also on board that train were 2 companies of regular troops that were coming from the Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania that were going to reinforce Fort McHenry, the famous fort in Baltimore from the War of 1812. That was still an active Army installation. And so they were reinforcing that. And so because you had about 80 regular soldiers who had their rifles with them and acted like they knew how to use them, they escorted the soldiers from Pennsylvania to the train they needed to be on to get to Washington, and they got there. But what this had the effect of doing was just stirring up the people of Baltimore. They were outraged. They were like inflamed because, again, they were very pro-Southern in their sympathies, and they couldn't believe that these, what they were calling mercenaries from the North, were crossing through their city to go and to kill other Americans. That was the mindset. And so that's all brewing in Baltimore on April 18th, going into April 19th. And of course, Colonel Jones hears about this, and he's in Philadelphia. He's got urgent orders to get to Washington, D.C., because there's really no organized military organization in Washington. There's some militia companies, but their loyalties are more Southern, and they're a bigger threat to the government than they are a protection. And there's only a handful of regular Army troops. So they're really desperate to get these regiments from the North, and Jones knows that. So let's talk about the geography of Baltimore a little bit. We actually have some benefits in comprehending this because the train system in Baltimore is a little bit like the train system in Boston. If you want to take a train from Lowell to New York City, you go from the Gallagher Terminal to where? You go to North Station. And where do you pick up the train in New York? South Station. So how do you get from North Station to South Station? You walk, you subway, you take... And it was the same way in Baltimore. Trains from the north came into the President Street Station, which was, it's actually on the east side of the harbor that comes in here. And the trains going to Washington left the Camden Street Station, which is where Camden Yards baseball field is now. Now, the standard procedure was that rather than have people unload all their baggage and walk this 1.5 miles, what they would do is they would decouple individual rail cars and they would hitch them to a team of horses. And the horses would drag these cars one by one through the streets of Baltimore, almost like little streetcars, to get to Camden Station. And once they got there, they'd either switch cars or maybe the same ones would just get hooked up to an engine and continue on. And so the Pennsylvania troops, when they had arrived at another station. It was somewhere up here. They had to march or this distance, so that they were out in the open for a while. The 6th Regiment arrived here. Now, Colonel Jones had heard from the railroad executives that Baltimore was going to be very dangerous. And so he had planned to get the entire regiment off the train and to march as a group through the streets, and he thought just the sheer size of the unit would intimidate the crowd into not creating any trouble. But what happened somewhere along the line, when the train coming from Philadelphia to Baltimore crossed the Susquehanna River, it did so by ferry. Individual cars would be ferried across and then attached. Now this is all happening at like 3 o'clock in the morning, and if you've ever had to stay up for a couple of days straight, you know, you get kind of groggy and it's very easy to fall asleep. I think what happened was everyone was asleep, and when they reattached the cars, they were in a different order. So Colonel Jones thought he was in the first car, when actually he was like in the fourth or fifth one. So they got to Baltimore before he knew it, and the train workers in Baltimore immediately attached the horses to the first car and started dragging it through the city. And by the time Jones realized what was going on, 6 cars containing 6 of the 11 companies of the 6th Regiment were on their way through the street to Camden Station. And they made it, but they also alerted the crowd. The 7th car, which also contained the executive officer of the regiment, a guy named Major Watson, when it got to, there's a little, like a river or a canal here, the mob had blocked the track, and it caused the car to go off, and they started throwing rocks at the car. It was breaking the windows. He ordered the men to lie down on the floor. Watson very bravely got out. He grabbed a guy that was going by with a horse team. They got the car back on the track, and they eventually made it over to Camden Station. But it was a very tough route. As that was happening, the mob was tearing up the rails that were needed. So over on Pratt Street, that's this main street, the rails were torn up. They had dragged anchors from the docks and blocked the way. The railroad executives told the 4 company commanders that were left, with about 200 men, we can't take you by car, and they decided to march. So this formation of 4 companies, about 200 men, started marching from here with this as their destination. They walked up, actually here it's called President Street. Somebody had torn up the bridge over this waterway, but they described it as hopscotching their way over the beams of the bridge. Just as they got across that, the crowd started closing in, and what it really sounds like they were doing was they were trying to steal the rifles away from the soldiers, and in some cases they succeeded. The roads were made of cobblestones. Those were being torn up and thrown. The soldiers were getting hit by them. Suddenly people were shooting. That's where Addison Whitney got shot. He was shot in the chest, I believe, and he died very quickly. Ladd, who was, again, is only 17 years old, what the story that I've read of him is that somebody wrestled away his rifle. They knocked him to the ground. He was very badly beaten, and then they shot him in the leg, and he eventually bled to death, although he lived for several hours more. The crowd didn't think that these guys had any ammunition for their guns. So at that point, the captain who was leading the column ordered the men to open fire. And so they started shooting back at the civilians. That caused the crowd to back off a little bit. And the mayor of Baltimore actually showed up and yelled at the crowd. That helped them back off. And the mayor led the procession along here, but a 200-man formation kind of stretches out. So what happened is they were walking along, the mob started attacking the back of the crowd again. Eventually some police officers, about 50 of them who were at Camden Station, came and got between the mob and the soldiers, and they were able to continue on. Sumner Needham, the private or corporal from Lawrence who was killed, I believe was shot over in this vicinity. Now in all there were like 32 men who were injured or shot of the 6. There were only 4 that died. I mentioned Ladd, Whitney, Needham, and the 4th one was this guy named Charles Taylor that nobody really knows too much about. He apparently signed up for the regiment the day they were leaving. He didn't even have a uniform. When he fell, they thought he was one of the civilians. He was left behind. And there's a great mystery about whether his body's ever been found. There's a plaque in his name on the Ladd and Whitney Monument, and we'll have some other talk about the whereabouts of Charles Taylor's body and what happened to it sometime in the future. I'll get back to that in a minute. So that's what happens. Now, the final companies get to Camden Station, and Jones is outraged, partly because, well, here's some pictures. This is a mural at the Massachusetts State House about the 6th Regiment. Here's another picture and another one. So they get to the Camden Station, and the railroad officials want to get these guys out of here because they don't want the mob to come in and destroy the station and their track. They don't want their property damaged. So they're telling Major Jones, you got to go, you got to go. But the 25 members of the 6th Regiment Band are still back at President Street Station. They had traveled in a boxcar because their instruments were too big to fit in a car. And I don't know whether, I've read one account which said, oh no, we're not going out there. We're not having any guns. We're going to stay here where it's safe. And another was they were just kind of left behind or forgotten. But there's these 25 guys who are kind of cowering in this boxcar with their oboes and their drums. And in addition to that, there's like 800 more guys from Pennsylvania who don't have uniforms or guns who are also on this train. And they're all sitting at its Camden Station while this riot is going on throughout the town. And so what happens is Jones has this dilemma. Part of him wants to go back and march through the city with his 600 armed men and extract some revenge and recover the bodies and the wounded and the band and then continue on. But these railroad guys are saying, you got to go, you got to go. And in his mind, he's thinking, you know, at this very moment, the Confederates could be crossing the Potomac River and capturing the president and the Capitol. And so they told us we got to get there right away. So he says, all right, let's go. And so he allows the train to pull out and head towards Washington, leaving behind the 4 dead and a couple of dozen wounded and the entire band. Now the mob turns on the band and the Pennsylvania soldiers, beats them up, destroys their instruments. Some pro-Union people from Baltimore got the band. It was actually a house of ill repute is where they were sheltered for a while, and they eventually were put on a train and came back. When they get back to Lowell, they were treated heroically. They were exhibiting their drums with the drum heads torn out and all the damage. 5 p.m., the 6th Regiment arrived in Washington. They weren't quartered in any army base. They were quartered in the Senate chamber in the United States Capitol. That was the best place they had to put them. And there's a picture of it under construction at about that time. All right, let's look at the geography a little bit, because that's a very dramatic account, what happened to these men from Lowell, but where does it fit into the wider course of events? So up here you had Philadelphia, Washington, and then down here is Fortress Monroe. That's at Hampton Roads, Virginia. It's just across from Norfolk. That was a Union Army installation. Now you have Baltimore on April 19th has completely gone over to the Confederate side. The mayor, the police chief, they didn't want any more soldiers coming from the north, so they actually sent police out to burn the bridges over the rivers and streams coming into Baltimore, and they succeeded in doing that. So the rail route through Baltimore was completely cut off. Even if they wanted to send troops through, they couldn't unless they first repaired those bridges. So Baltimore is cut off, and that was really the only way to get from Philadelphia or from New England to Washington. Harper's Ferry. There's an arsenal at Harper's Ferry. They make guns there. They had thousands and thousands of rifles stored there. And that explains why they were sending unarmed men from Pennsylvania to Washington. The plan was to pick up the rifles that were stored at Harper's Ferry, bring them by train to Washington, and unite them with these soldiers. But on April 18th, before the 6th was anywhere near Baltimore, hundreds of Confederate soldiers started converging on Harper's Ferry. And that was defended by only 45 Union soldiers under the command of a lieutenant. He decided there was no way he could hold out, so he burned as much as he could, and they, on foot, retreated north into through Maryland to go back to Pennsylvania. So Harper's Ferry, which is the main route in from the northwest into Washington and Baltimore, is now in Confederate hands. Down here you have this place across from Fort Monroe called the Gosport Navy Yard. That was the major naval base of the United States Navy. That's where one of the newest ships, the USS Merrimack, was. There were 6 or 8 other ships there. There was gunpowder. All of the Navy stores were there. And of course, the Virginia militia start converging on that. And they take possession of Gosport, which, even though Fort Monroe is under Union hands, it closes off Chesapeake Bay, which is another route up to Washington, up the Potomac River. So by April 20th, Washington, D.C. is totally surrounded by hostile forces, and it's completely cut off from the north. And that lasted. On the 24th, Abraham Lincoln went to visit the 6th Regiment at the Capitol. And this is what he said. He was very despondent. He said, "I don't believe there's any north." The 7th Regiment, which was from New York, which was supposed to be there, he called it a myth. Rhode Island is no longer known in our geography. Now, for Lincoln, the commander-in-chief, be talking to privates from the 6th Regiment from Lowell, sounding like this, he must have been feeling hopeless. And it was with good reason, because if Virginia moved more quickly, they could have captured him, the cabinet, and the Capitol, because there really was no escape, and there was nobody to defend the place. And then Ben Butler comes to the rescue. 5 names of places that we're going to talk about: Philadelphia, Perryville, Annapolis, Annapolis Junction, and Washington. Let's get back to our map. All right, so Butler had accompanied the 8th Regiment. Butler had kind of convinced Governor Andrew to name him as commander of the brigade of those 4 regiments. And probably because 2 of them were going down here and only 2 were up here, Andrew said, okay, that's fine. So the 6th is in Washington. The 8th Regiment is stuck in Philadelphia because they can't get through Baltimore, and they've got to get to Washington. The 7th New York Regiment, which is their most ready one, also shows up in Philadelphia. So what Butler does is he takes the train to Perryville, which is the crossing of the Susquehanna River. And there, he takes the ferry boat, it was called the Maryland, that was used to move the trains across the river to continue south. And he either charters it or hijacks it or some combination of the two. And they sail down, bypassing Baltimore, to Annapolis, which is the capital of Maryland. Annapolis is also filled with pro-Southern people. In the naval academies there, a lot of the naval officers were pro-Southern. And here comes Ben Butler and the 8th Regiment steaming into Annapolis Harbor on this ferry boat. And what's tied up at the dock at the Naval Academy? The USS Constitution, Old Ironsides. It was being used as a training ship for the Naval Academy. Butler goes on board the Constitution. There's this old captain and about 10 men there. They have all the cannons loaded, ready to fire. And the captain tells him the Southerners from the academy are going to, any minute now, they're going to come and seize this ship. So Butler reinforces the ship. He goes ashore, starts taking charge. Unfortunately, his ferry boat ran aground before he could get his men onto the shore. And so they're stuck out in the harbor. And I think he was kind of bluffing his way through. But fortunately for him, the 7th New York Regiment followed his lead and showed up the next morning on a ship. And they were able to get these 2 regiments ashore at Annapolis. Once there, they kind of took control. But the Southerners had torn up the tracks that ran from Annapolis to this place called Annapolis Junction, which is right here. Some of you might be familiar with Annapolis Junction because it's now known as Fort Meade. It's the site of the National Security Agency. So if you've ever driven to D.C., there's a big place you can't enter that says Fort Meade. That originally was Annapolis Junction, and it was because the train from Annapolis would join the train coming from Baltimore to Washington. But that was a key line of communication. But all the rails had been torn up, and they had taken all of the locomotives and moved them out towards Harper's Ferry. So in the industrial Ben Butler and his men, they find this old broken down locomotive in a shed. And he tells the civilians, I want you to get this working. And they, I don't know anything about it. I don't know anything about it. So he starts querying his men. And it turns out that the locomotive had been built in Lynn, Massachusetts. And one of his soldiers actually had worked on building this locomotive. And he said, General, I think I can get it running. And sure enough, he did. And a lot of the men in the regiment worked on the railroad because that was very important in New England. And pretty soon, they were putting the track together. They mounted a cannon on a flat car and started pushing it with this old locomotive. And the work crew would put the tracks together in front of them as they proceeded down to Annapolis Junction. And they took control of Annapolis Junction. And the 7th Regiment continued on its way to Washington. This is a little close-up. And on Thursday, April 25th, the 7th New York Regiment arrives in Washington. And just a week later, there were 10,000 Union troops in Washington, D.C. General Scott and Abraham Lincoln were so thankful for Butler that they named him the commander of the Department of Annapolis and told him to stay where he was and keep that rail line open. So he did that, but he didn't stop at that. What he did was he had his eyes on Baltimore and kind of taking revenge for what happened to the 6th. So on May 5th at 2 o'clock in the morning, he had the 6th Massachusetts advance by train to this place called Relay House, which is another train junction that was 9 miles south of Baltimore, another critical rail junction. And so they show up at the middle of the night. They dismount from the train, they filter off into the hills, and they take control of this place. And then on May 13th, in a driving rainstorm and thunderstorm at nighttime, Butler leads the 6th Massachusetts back into Baltimore and takes control of Federal Hill, which is like the key piece of high ground in the city of Baltimore. So the people of Baltimore, who were all closed up for the night because of the impending thunderstorm. If you've ever been in Maryland when there's a thunderstorm, you know why they'd be shut up at night. All of a sudden they wake up and there's 600 troops from Massachusetts on the high ground with a couple of cannons, and then they start rounding up pro-Southern leaders and locking them up in Fort McHenry. And on May 13th, less than exactly a month after the firing on Fort Sumter, Butler had succeeded in reopening the route from New England and the Atlantic seaboard through Baltimore to Washington. And back in Lowell, on May 6th, the bodies of Luther Ladd and Addison Whitney arrive. There's a huge procession. They're brought to Huntington Hall, where there's a memorial service for them. In 1865, this monument is erected in their honor that's right over in front of City Hall. It was supposed to be dedicated on the anniversary of the Baltimore riot on April 19th, 1865, but just a few days earlier, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and so it was postponed, and it was dedicated on Bunker Hill Day on June 17th, 1865. It's had many different settings through the years. Here's another one. This is at the corner of Dutton Street. That's Merrimack Street. Remember, City Hall wasn't built till 1898, so that doesn't show up in the background for a while. This is an envelope that was used to remember Luther Ladd and the story of what happened to him. This is a bigger picture at the State House. It's on the 3rd floor. It's right outside the hall of the chamber of the House of Representatives. You have this mural dedicated to these men from Lowell, in Baltimore. So that pretty much concludes my remarks.